Hello everybody, it's your pal E.V.A here, and I want to start this with a little story. When I was little, for the longest time, I wanted to be a pop star. This lasted for a while until I hit about 10 years old. It was then that the dream started to fade and I got a little scared because I didn't know what else to do. That was until I discovered YouTube, specifically speed paint videos. From there, I discovered people who posted their illustrations online, then people who made online animation series, and then people who made their own comics. Now, back when I was much younger, I read Calvin and Hobbes over and over, even copying some of the panels but with my characters. And for years, I had all these characters and worlds in my head, and that's when I knew I wanted to be a comic artist. I practiced with some fan comics while I was fleshing out and working on the universe that I wanted these comics to be in, and after a while I got the script all written out for what would be my first ever original comic, Lost Hearts. And after about a year and a half on working on it, I was able to finish it. And today is the day that I get to say that I'm now selling the physical copy on my Etsy shop right now. I was really emotional and happy when I saw the physical copies for the first time, and it made me realize that I wanted this dream for myself even more. Sorry for all the sappy stuff. Actually, to celebrate the listing for being up, I wanted to do something fun that I might do for other comics when I publish them, and that's to give them almost a behind the scene video about all the things that went into making it. I thought of calling it Behind the Pages, since it's comic pages instead of scenes. I think that's enough talk. Now let's jump into it, starting with part 1, where it started. This is probably going to be the most embarrassing part of the video, but around the time when I was younger, I was in the Undertale fandom, and what people like me like to do in the fandom was create our own fan stories / alternate universes or AUs. So Lost Hearts was originally an Undertale AU called Bright Tale. In fact, Lost Hearts is going to be in a trilogy, all of the titles called Hearts, and all of those also used to be Undertale AUs. So yeah, Dawn and Nadia were going to be versions of existing characters in Undertale, Nadia being Frisk and Dawn being Kara alongside the other characters. These are some of their first ever designs, and yeah, even in their old designs, they didn't look like Frisk or Kara at all, which did help make their canon looks look a lot different. I also played around with a design for Azriel and Flowey, who I imagine would change the colors of their petals in this one, and even made an artwork, which I remember taking forever. It was kind of fun looking back at all the concept art I made for this one, and I even got as far as starting the first pages. Now, like with my other attempts at making comics when I was younger, I didn't write down or lay anything out, so I redid the first page of this constantly, not being sure what I wanted it to be. Nowadays, I don't have a problem with this since I've learned the importance of planning beforehand, at least for me. Now, you might be wondering why I decided not to share the story as it was. This was for several reasons. One, during the whole time I was developing my comic universe, which was originally just where I played with all the stories and characters and things that I loved from different media as a crossover thing, but when I realized I wanted this to be a series, I actually created original stories for it. And so the former Bright Tale had to follow as well. The other thing was by this time I was out of the Undertale fandom, so I wouldn't have been interested in working on the series anyway. Luckily though, since I already had the characters planned, it made this next step go much easier, and that is part 2, prepping the story and characters. So now that this was going to be an original story, I had to come up with a different title. Luckily, it actually wasn't that hard. I thought of Hearts as a good name for the whole trilogy, and since the story was going to be them lost in a labyrinth, it naturally became Lost Hearts. The second thing to come up with was the character names. I looked up a list of names that meant things that I wanted them to mean. Dawn is a name that means bright, which is an homage to the original story, and Nadia means hope, which makes sense for their character and relates to a future character that I want them to parallel. Now, of course, for the actual story. If you've read the story and also know about Undertale, you might have been able to tell that there were some Undertale influence, but I did try to make this more original. Because Dawn and Nadia were really the only two important characters in the original story, I knew just having them as the characters would work fine. I also wanted to play with one of my favorite type of stories, which if you've seen the animation promoting this, you might have been able to guess it already, but does have to do with time loops. But I also wanted to add in some mystery and some creepiness in some of the scenes as well. and some emotional stuff, but you can't get to see all of that, and you'll get to it when you read the story. I don't want to spoil too much here. Once I got to figuring out the story, I made their first original designs, which became their main ones. I will admit I didn't put too much thought into these, and I do kind of wish I had made a second draft, but when I was drawing them in the comic, they just sort of stuck, and they were extremely simple, which was super nice when drawing them over and over and over and over again. I kept their main colors, Nadia being pink and Dawn being red, and kept their original hairstyles. I wanted them to have the same high ponytail looks, but with different lengths, and Nadia's being more spiky than Dawn's to match their personality. Dawn surprisingly didn't change too much between this and her first look. I think I just got too attached to her outfit, but I did alter it slightly. Nadia's looks much different. Overall, I wanted their designs to match their personalities. Nadia's more adventurous and outgoing, so her look is more simple and lightweight. Dawn is more conscious and shy, but she probably wasn't always, since when you die and become a ghost in my universe, you tend to forget a lot about yourself. And when you are alive, as mentioned in the story, the look also makes her seem a bit older, by like a year or so, but definitely gives her the older teen look. Now, while working on this story, I definitely used these little rough draft sheets at the beginning of the story, but I never actually got around to making proper rough sheets for them. Now, this was fine because they were very simple, and I was able to memorize their anatomy and stuff, and I kept a thing separate for their colors, but I definitely don't advise not having a rough sheet as a beginner unless you're confident enough that you can make comics without them. After working on the characters, it was time for the actual story script. I was able to get it right super fast, but I do kind of wish I revised it in some areas before starting the page, because I had to do that revising while working on the pages. For example, I added 3 whole pages that wasn't in the original script because I felt like it was necessary for the story, but other than that, I felt like the rest of the story was fine. At first, I had tried writing in page numbers to estimate what would be in each page, but I eventually gave up on that, and now I don't do that at all in my scripts and just figure it out when I do my thumbnails. I still remember how excited I was to finish this script, since it was the first script I ever finished, but that was just the beginning. The next thing I did was work a little on the concept art for the backgrounds, which was super easy because the majority of the backgrounds look like this, but I did do a little work to see how I would paint those, and eventually stumbled upon this brush and Medibang paint that was perfect for textures. By the way, I did actually do the majority of Lost Hearts in the program Medibang Paint. This was way before I started in Clip Studio Paint, which I do think is a little better for comic making, but for the way I made comics, Medibang was good for that. The biggest thing I wanted to work on was the Crystal Garden, which became sort of a staple for the whole story. The first version ended up like this, and obviously this isn't how it looks in the comic, but it was really nice to have this first draft to figure out some of the details I needed or to add, mainly in the tree. Since I wanted it to be very crystal-like, I had to adjust how I shaded the tree, and I decided to even make this diamond leaf brush for the leaves. Are they that noticeable? No, but it's there. It's there. I also just decided to add these diamond hanging things from the branches. After the flowers, I also wanted them to be diamond-like, and I remember it taking much longer to figure out how to shade those than the tree, surprisingly. I left the water and grass alone. Those are probably actual grass and water, most likely. Now, these two were really the only background concepts I did. Everything else was made while working on the page, which was okay for this comic since they weren't really difficult backgrounds. I do still think it would have been better to at least do some thumbnail sketches beforehand. The reason why I decided to do the background concept first was so I could make the first cover page. This was the cover that I used for Webtoon for the entire run, and I remember making it to kind of resemble an artwork I made when this was still Brighttail. After doing those, I made the layouts, which I'm really glad that I figured out how to do those before this, so I wouldn't be stumbling over the first page. Now, it's been a while. I can't quite remember how many layouts I made before starting, but I know that I didn't do all the layouts. When working on my other comics, I make the layouts by chapter, but because this was over 100 pages, I did a couple dozen at a time, figuring out my layout style as I went. Most of the time, I stuck to what I did in the layouts, but there were a few times where I deviated. Now, after I did the layouts, I put them into their canvases, which I thought was the right size. Before working on this, I did look up comic sizes, and I don't know if this is because the source I found was incorrect or had misremembered or miscalculated, because the size I used was horribly off of being an actual comic size, a standard one at least. This was a time when I would set up canvases, I would only think in terms of pixels without inches in mind, and this definitely hurt when it came to time to getting these pages ready to print. I also made the same mistake when working on the first few pages of Dysteria and Haiku, so guess who's gonna have to work on that before printing those? Yay! The actual page size for Lost Hearts ended up being these, and luckily this worked well when they were printed, but that was everything as far as setting up. Now, it was actually time to work on the pages, but oh boy, did I not realize what that would be like. Part 3. The pages themselves and the struggle. So when working on the pages, I actually started the first few pages on vacation on the summer of 2021, which for some reason I thought was enough to start posting them. This was the summer right before school was going to start again, and it was at this point that I was a little nervous. During the summer, I would have all the time in the world, but when school would start, that would change. Keep in mind, we were doing online school at the time, but even though the hours weren't as long most days, we also had a pretty busy schedule doing other things, so this definitely slowed my work time by a lot. And I got to the point where I could only work on it a couple hours during 2 days a week. Eventually, our schedule became less intense, so it was easier to work on more, but this was definitely the reason why this took me so long. That plus my inexperience with comic making. It was definitely pretty hard. There were a lot of times where I wasn't really having fun working on it, but I also was extremely determined to finish it. So, little by little, page by page, I pushed through. Even though it was a lot, I do look back on it now with fond memories, and there were times where I was having a good time working on the pages while chilling, listening to a podcast, stuff like that. But back to what I briefly talked about, which was posting this as a webcomic. Now you might be wondering, why post it online first? The reason why is, for me, I mainly just want to share my stories to people, and I knew I wouldn't be able to wait to share it, so that's why I decided to share the webcomic version for free while working on the pages. Besides the scrolling format, if you have read the online version and have the comic with the full pages, you'll notice a big difference. This is because I actually made the webcomic pages by making sure all the panels are separate from the gradient background and copying and pasting just the panels. I do this so that it's easier to read, makes for longer episodes, and so the quality of the images don't get too blurry. I'm lucky I was able to figure this out early so I could use the same method for my other comics. You also have to keep the thumbnails in mind, which I just kept in one folder and just chose one of the pictures in the episodes to use. Now, I was posting for a while, and you might have noticed the gradual style change throughout. For example, at the beginning of the story, I only used a single line to draw the eyebrows and always had these circular highlights in the hair regarding the lighting. I also didn't use any textured lines. By the end though, the line art became more textured, and I actually added shapes to the eyebrows and used more realistic lighting. These were all just because of my overall art style changing and improving, but because of the type of story this was, I actually found a good opportunity to draw in what was my current style after the end of the first section, and I could just blame the style change on the circumstances of the story. And it wasn't just my style that improved when making this. Like I said before, I gained a lot of knowledge about making comics while making this. How to keep my layers organized, the importance of having a workflow, making sure to keep color palettes saved, if not just for the characters, but for the backgrounds and shading colors. It was also here where I learned it's easiest for me to draw the background first in order to know what my shading colors would be. I also learned when paneling that I should make sure that I have a good gap width, so that when I cut the panels right for Reptune, it would be a lot easier. I already have a whole video talking about my illustration process when it comes to comics in a separate video, and a lot of it is still pretty accurate, so I recommend giving that a watch. And yeah, that was pretty much it for my comic making process. It's pretty similar to how I make comics nowadays, only a few stylistic changes, of course. But with that, I wanted to go over a very fun part that I thought would be fun to explain, and that is Part 4. What wasn't explained? First of all, the colors. Colors are something I love using when it comes to telling stories. I use it more in my other stories, but I also tried using it here. The three main colors of the story were pink, red, and purple. Obviously, purple was used more often and was used to express a feeling of being lost, whether they were in a cave wandering around or if they were about to make bad decisions. Pink was used more in the garden and in specific lighting scenarios, representing a more safe space and comfort. Red was used in the least often, but used for feelings of, well, violence and anger. Other colors didn't really mean much, but you may interpret them as you wish. Next is, well, the whole environment of the story and the people who came before. The cave, or really labyrinth, was the home of an ancient species called the Akumas. The Akumas aren't actually native to the land that the story takes place on, but they weren't sent there as punishment. The humans thought they were monsters and even demons, so they had to separate into different clans and hide from the humans. One clan lives in the forest, one clan lives in the mountains, and this clan lives in the labyrinth. You might have noticed, but the official clan color of these Akumas are purple, and each clan does have their own color as well. Although the Akumas themselves didn't have any magic, they found magic in the environments that they were in, for the ones underground being the mimicking crystals. Mimicking crystals are a naturally growing substance. Often growing in clusters under valleys and higher in the mountains. Mimicking crystals, you can probably guess, have the ability to mimic different things. They can mimic organic life, sounds, and even magic. The clan were able to cultivate the mimicking crystals to mimic flowers and trees and have them make the soil more nutrient for agriculture. The library is also something I'd like to briefly touch on. It's the main place where Akumas would write down their history and the spells they learned to use. If Dawn and Nadia had looked through a little more, they might have been able to uncover something so ancient, even predating the Akuma's arrival. The last main environment is the altar room. I saved this for last because it ties directly into the biggest question: where did the Akumas go? If you've read the comic, you might have been able to guess who chased them out. Yep, this thing. This is a demon. Where did it come from? This wasn't explained at all in the comic, and I didn't really want it to. Well, it was kind of alluded to the fact that there was an altar room with what kind of looks like a demonic symbol on it, which is the demon's official symbol, but the demon was born from a ritual. I'm not going to go full in depth with the lore of my demons because it's pretty complex. I want to save it for a different video, but we'll just say that the demon was born when someone was trying desperately to save their kid. This thing was able to chase the Akumas out, but luckily they established a safeguard to make sure it wouldn't escape. Even though demons can be really powerful, this one is far from being the strongest, so in order to escape it, it would need a physical form, and since demons can possess people, you can probably see why I'd wanted Nadia so badly. I knew I wanted the demon to look more like a missing shadow, or a misty shadow, but for some reason when I was first drawing them, I drew them with line art. Luckily, I learned later that drawing them without line art works much better. Am I particularly proud of its design? No. But it's there. Drawing it as the form of Nadia was really cool though. Trying to keep in the wispy effects to show how hard it is for them to change form. There is a reason for that, but I might have another video explaining that. But that's probably all I'll say, so I won't spoil too much here. Now, let's get into the final part, which is Part 5, the final steps. These were all done before getting it printed. The first thing I did was remake the cover, which I did a while in advance. I also wanted to add a couple extra pages at the end of the book for thank you messages and info about my other comics. I also had to add a page so that the double page spread would print right. Like I said before, because I didn't draw these in an actual printing size, and custom sizes were really expensive, I had to resize all of my pages beforehand. Luckily, this doesn't turn out to ruin any pages, and looked quite good printed. The size, I believe, is 5x7, or the standard manga size. The site I used was Mixium, and it's a pretty good site. I only really had trouble with it because this was my first time printing any comic, but aside from the parts where I was just struggling with printing in general, the site worked pretty well. The last few pages that I would need to make were the back and the spine. I pretty much just copy and pasted the synopsis of the webtoon description for the back, along with a blurred background, but the spine was a bit more tricky. Making it was fine. I knew I wanted to two important items on the top and bottom and the title, but it was the size that was getting me because for some reason I couldn't export it into the size it required for the life of me. This part alone took me forever to do, but I was finally able to figure it out using Canva. It really only required such a small size because of how thin the entire book would be. Future comic of mine should be thicker, so I shouldn't have any problems with that. After getting through a couple of extra technical problems, my books were finally ready to go. I was so excited to finally have a physical copy of something that I worked so hard on. It made me realize that it was all so worth it, and it made me super excited to work on more comics. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. I've been wanting to make something like this for a while, and I really hope you'll consider getting a copy of the comic. And this is far from the last time I'll do this either. Since my other stories aren't nearly as short as this one, they'll probably be multi-volume projects. So keep an eye out for potentially the first volume of one of my comics that I've worked on that you might know of. And like I teased earlier, Lost Hearts is going to be in a trio of short stories, and I'll update more about those stories as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. All of my normal stuff will be in the description, my Instagram, my webtoon where you can read these comics. And that's about it. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!